Welcome to the Mad Ones. I'm your great hater of Christmas and every holiday not explicitly commanded in the Hebrew Scriptures host, Cam Harless. And with me tonight is your favorite, definitely an elf because she's almost shorter than Danny DeVito hostess, Miss Jessica Green. And the only good thing to ever come out of California, your favorite almond farmer, Mr. Whip and Spoon, is joining me as a guest co-host as well. Welcome back to the show, guys.
Thanks, buddy.
I am stoked to have this conversation because this is actually last year. I know Jessica knows this. I was looking to have this very conversation with, and I couldn't find the person that I needed to have this conversation with. And so it's a year late, but we're finally doing it. So I'm stoked about this. But before we do that, I need to let you know that this show is 100% brought to you by fans and patrons. So hit like, subscribe, and share the show with your friends. There are all sorts of topics we've covered. Share them with someone who might gain something from them. Also, join Patreon for the occasional early episode. Today, we're starting out something new, extended episodes, I'm going to be calling Last Call. And share the show. I went back in my brain, and you'll get my eternal gratitude. So hit up patreon.com/themadOnes. And if you would like to support me, I would like it if you would support me, but I mean, whatever. If you'd like to support me overall, another way to do that is going to wearethemadOnes.com/store, and you can get something with a logo or some of our Christmas stuff, and rep us everywhere you are, anywhere you are. So let's get to the main show. Joining us tonight is the bane of bad arguments, the slayer of uncited sources, the annihilator of inadequate ideas, and an apologist making his name on TikTok. He's the great fear of those who tout the old heresies. Please welcome to the show, Michael Jones, a.k.a. Inspiring Philosophy. What's up, dude?
Hey, Mike.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Like I said, I have been annoyed with, obviously, the name of this episode and everything I've said so far is a bait and switch. If you're here thinking I'm going to trash Christmas, you're getting the opposite. But
and you don't know Cam very well, clearly.
Yeah, you don't. I mean, literally, it's Santa Claus with a knife. If you bought that, I feel sorry for you.
Why does he have a knife?
Surprised. I don't know, dude. I was looking up evil Santa, and like the other things had like satanic stuff, and I was just like, I really like this knife. This pulp knife photo with him carrying a woman off. Like, what is this? I love it. But no, when I was like 20 or 22-ish, I dated a girl who called herself a Seventh-day Baptist, and her family did not celebrate Christmas at all. And first off, I was like, I didn't know Seventh-day Baptist existed. Secondly, why not Christmas? And so I think that may have been the first time I heard that verse out of Jeremiah taken out of context and just destroyed in front of me. So since that point, I've wanted to have this conversation because I've done, independent research as to why these claims are silly. But I wanted to find someone who's actually done the work, and you have several videos on YouTube. I think there's a documentary. You'll have to remind me of the name of the documentary, but Jim Staley is the name of the man who made the documentary. And like, it started off bad and didn't get better from there. So
yeah, that documentary is like 15 years old, I think, or something. But it was like the first thing I heard that was arguing against Christmas like all those years ago, and I was like, this is just bad on so many levels. And it started me on. It was one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that really started me on researching this whole issue, because I was just mortified by the fear mongering in it, and like, oh, you can't celebrate Christmas because you might be worshiping Nimrod. I'm like, that's not how worship works.
Right. Well, not just that, but like, so I mean, I would love to like go through some of the different points that he made in that, and I'm sure Whip has some things that he was like, I don't see how this is wrong, that I'd love for him to pick up. Or Jessica's the only one who didn't watch the documentary, so she's a clean slate, so we get to watch her reaction to these claims. But I will say,
it's intentional.
The name of the documentary we're talking about, for the record, is Truth or Tradition: Passion for Truth Ministries.
That's it. That's the one. And I will note, he's actually coming out with Truth or Tradition 2.0 next month. And I have a friend of mine who is fluent in Latin and Greek, and he's Catholic, and him and I are going to respond to it on my channel probably when it comes out, because We're not letting the second one get by that easily.
Is he a friendly guy? Will he entertain debate?
Jim?
Yeah.
I hope so. I've talked to him in private about it. I told him I'm going to do it if he comes out with it, and he's going full forward. So, all right, you ask for it, but we'll be ready for him.
All right, I like that.
I think what I think is amazing is as I watched the documentary, I picked up a lot of facts that came from what a pamphlet was from the 1850s by Isaac Hislop. Is that his name?
No, it's Alexander Hislop.
Alexander
Hislop. He wrote called The Two Babylons.
Okay. Which, I have it as a PDF and it said pamphlet. So I just called it a pamphlet, but it is longer than a pamphlet. I remember when I started reading it, I was like, there are way too many pages for this to be a pamphlet, but that's what they called it.
It's a book. Yeah.
But it was called The Two Babylons, and it's the entire book. The basis of it is a polemic against Roman Catholicism.
Basically, and it's just riddled with problems, but it's so sensationalist. People just sort of picked it up and ran with it, even though one of Hislop's own student, I think his name is Ralph Woodthrow. I can't remember if that's his exact name, but he basically debunked it in that day and age. But no one remembers that. Everyone remembers Hislop's book, and they just keep going with it.
Yeah. So let's.
It's a book written. It's published by the Presbyterian Free Church of Scotland in 1853. There's no chance it's going to have anything good to say about Catholics coming out of Scotland in the mid 1800s.
Yeah, but I mean, Ralph Woodthrow basically debunked it, shortly after it came out, and he was originally a disciple, you could say, of Hislop. But yeah, to this day, it still is a sensationalist piece of crap that it gets all these people going. Because it's just so out there, oh yeah, the Catholic Church is continuing Babylonian worship, and clearly, no one understands what the Babylonians believe when they read this book.
So let's start.
Rapture?
Did you say the rapture?
I was going to ask a question real quick and derail this before we even get started. Wasn't the rapture written about by some preacher who kind of just made up some shit and made up a date and got his flock to go stand on a hill somewhere, and then the date happened and he's like, I got my math wrong.
That's
sorry, I forgot to carry something.
Yeah, what you're referring to is the Millerite movement, and Miller basically said that he thought Jesus was returning in 1842 and then 1843. It turned out he was wrong. Spoiler. And then out of that movement came the Seventh-day Adventists, and they believe Jesus did return, but it was a spiritual return. He just came to sort of set up the spiritual tabernacle and temple. And the prophetess Ellen G. White came out of that movement, and they started that whole church.
And then eventually David Koresh on down the line.
A whole other crazy episode.
But I've mentioned this already, but there's the verse that people use to say that you should not have Christmas trees, which is Jeremiah 10, 2 and 3, which I'm actually I'm on the Net Bible translation at the moment, which makes it so clear that it's stupid. Let me try to find one that's slightly less clear. So that their argument sounds like it exists. Let's see.
I typically use the ESV.
Try to steel man it.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do by trying to bring in a different translation of the Bible. So Jeremiah 10, 2. Learn not the way of the nations, nor be dismayed at the signs of the heavens, because the nations are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vanity. A tree from the forest is cut down and worked with an axe by the hands of a craftsman. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with hammer and nails so that it cannot move. And that's the couple verses that people say that's saying you can't have a Christmas tree.
That just off the bat, that doesn't actually strike me as a Christmas tree at all.
What does it strike you of?
A staff, maybe that's been carved on, or metal or jewels have been set into it.
Well, if it's an idol, and it says it more, like I said, in the Net Bible, it says it more clearly. But when it says they decorate it with silver and gold, you're looking at gilding it, putting layers of gold and silver. Yeah. It's talking about making actual
There's
idols.
A woodworking element to it, which suggests you cut the limbs off too.
So when was the first time you heard this being used this way? Can I call you Mike?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was Jehovah's Witnesses on my doorstep years ago. And it's like, I just asked, I'm like, well, just keep reading. And so I said, read verse 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And they're going down and they're getting to verse 11. And I'm like, all right, that's enough there. I think if we read the context, this is talking about crafting an idol. It says they're scarecrows. They're like scarecrows. It says they can't speak. They have to be carried. Don't be afraid of them, for they can't do evil.
They can't walk.
They can't walk. There is not a scholar alive out there who thinks this is about decorating pine trees or Christmas trees. I mean, no one. The only people who make this claim are laymen on the internet who have not done research. Every scholar out there will tell you this is about crafting an idol, because Christmas trees didn't even show up until the 1500s.
You have something, Whip?
Don't know.
Sorry, I was just qualifying myself as a layman who just takes what he reads on the internet as face value. Just believe everything I read on the internet. That's why I've been catfished like 17 times. Go ahead.
But that's what's fun. That's what's funny is because I remember the first time I read it, like I read idol and like immediately. I didn't have to read down further. I was just like, well, what's he doing with the axe? Because you don't do anything with a Christmas tree after that. And also the idea that there were Christmas trees in the time of Jeremiah or of any sort is a bizarre claim in and of itself. So what was your first? So you heard it from the Jehovah's Witnesses. You read it out of the context. And so a lot of times, once you prove that that's not what the Bible says, they typically follow up with some claim from a different religion. So
yeah, they'll claim it was somehow used in paganism, and what they're doing is a correlation causation fallacy. It's like this. It's like, look, isn't Jesus called the Lion of the tribe of Judah? Yes, but in ancient Egypt there was a war deity that was a goddess that was also a lion. Does that mean when you call Jesus the Lion of the tribe of Judah, you're actually calling him a pagan deity? No, because correlation is not causation. Just because pagans at times worship trees, that doesn't mean that's where the Christmas tree came from. So what they're doing is they're just saying, oh, well, pagans didn't like trees. Well, you can't, use it because pagans have used trees in the past. And it's a ridiculous argument, because I can just appeal to Isaiah 41, 19, and 20, which says, I will put in the wilderness the plane, the pine, the acacia. These will be a symbol to the Lord of Israel. So God says the pine tree, along with other trees, are a symbol of him. So, okay, right then and there, clearly God can use trees, even though pagans have used trees.
Right. Well, and it's like what you look at is there's a lot of subversion within other religions and things like that from earlier truth. I mean, and also you have to consider that, especially in we're not even talking specifically about the Semitic regions, but they like to bring it back to Babylon. But they'll also go as far as, like, Jim Staley went as far as the Norse gods and tried to make Odin one of the favorite gods in Rome. And I'm like,
yeah, I know. Well, what's weird is that they would have equated Jupiter or Zeus with Thor more, because they did syncretism back then. So they equated Zeus with Baal Hadad. They equated him with Thor, because why? They're thunder deities, and Jupiter was a thunder deity.
Right. Well, and that was one of the first things of his documentary that completely threw me off. Was well, first off, he said that Nimrod became Baal, and that Baal was a sun god. Yeah. And I'm like, well, you're wrong on those two things completely, because Baal was a god of storm and vegetation, of fertility. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was never a sun god.
No,
that was Anu.
No, that was Anu is the sky deity. The sun deity is Shamash or Utu. Shamash, he shows up in the Baal cycle as well. He's the sun god. But Baal is not even his name. Baal is a title that means Lord. You can refer to your husband as Baal, even in the ancient context. But what happened was,
love that.
Oh yeah. But what happened is because they thought the name Hadad was so holy, they stopped pronouncing it. Sort of like the God of Israel as well. They stopped pronouncing it as the divine name. And they just started calling him Lord, which is Baal. And it just became synonymous with his name. But yeah, he was a storm deity, a warrior deity. And so, yeah, there's no evidence to think Baal was ever a sun deity. That's just blatantly wrong.
Well, and the other, what was the other? Let me try to think of the other claims at the beginning of that. One of them being that that Christmas is on December 25th because that is also the birthday of Mithra. And Mithra was born of a virgin and had 12 disciples and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting here and correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Mithra born from a rock? Like just he emerged from a rock?
Well, in some legends, yeah. In some legends, we don't, there's not a lot of records of what the Mithraic cult in Rome even believed about him. We all get it from secondhand sources. But yeah, the only legend we have of his birth is that he's born out of a rock. And he didn't have 12 disciples. He wasn't born of a virgin. He wasn't born on December 25th. That's just wrong. I mean, there's no other way to put it. There's no evidence in any early text that says Mithra's birthday was celebrated on December 25th.
Yeah, I mean, well, there were other ones. It's like one of the claims that I've kind of seen across all of the different little claims they make is that, oh, well, this guy did miracles, and it's like, which deities didn't?
Yeah, I mean, technically, every deity has the power to do miracles. So, well, it's just same with the Jesus mythicists. They just try to find vague associations with Jesus, and they're like, aha, we got a match. No, you don't. That the correlation is not causation. I mean, I could do this as well. I mean, I could find, look, you see a storm deity in Greece and you see a storm deity in Canaan. They must have copied each other. Well, no, because Zeus is different than Baal in a lot of ways. And Zeus has also affinity with the Egyptian sun god Ra-Amun, as in they're both like the head of the pantheon. But he's a sun deity. So you can find correlations anywhere you look. That doesn't mean there's causation there.
Yeah. Well, it's like in that documentary, he showed like all of these different places that had images of the sun in different ways. And he included the Catholic Church. And he's like, oh, so clearly they're worshiping the sun. That's why they moved the Sabbath to Sunday. And it's like, everyone sees the sun. And who created it? Who do we believe created it? So are we saying we can't use the sun anymore?
Well, that's not even what it says. I mean, Justin Martyr, one of the early church fathers, said we worship on Sunday because that's the day Jesus rose from the dead. It's the Lord's Day. And that's probably in Scripture as well. Like the book of Revelation says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. We see constant reference in early Christian works to the Lord's Day, and it always is reference to Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and that's what's like the people I've run into, especially on TikTok, the Torah observant people will be like, oh, well, they moved Sabbath to Sunday. And it's like, do you know nothing about the early church? They still went to the temple on the Sabbath. Paul spoke in it, and then they ate their meal together on the Lord's Day.
And then eventually the Jews prevented them from going. But yeah, early on they tried to do that. Yeah.
Amazing. I'm trying to find kind of a list of different things. So like, what are your favorite objections to Christmas that people have brought that you have debunked? Because, I have a lot of stuff in my head, but I have not thought of it on to the level you have and have it, I haven't responded to everything except for mentally.
Right. Well, let's start with the first one. Why was it placed on December 25th? Everyone brings this one up. They'll say things like, oh, it was selected because there was a pagan holiday on that day. And the Christians, when they got power under Constantine, they wanted to convert the pagan holidays into Christian holidays. Now, it's a plausible inference. There's just a problem. There's no evidence really to support it. Every sort of, there are no early Christian texts that state that's what the Christians wanted to do. We don't even have any evidence of a pagan holiday on December 25th before 354 AD and before Constantine. So scholars like Thomas Taylor, he wrote a really good book called The Origins of the Liturgical Calendar, as well as scholars like Peter Nothaft, Thomas Schmidt, Stephen Hidgmans have argued that, well, we can see evidence that Christians were probably keeping Christmas on December 25th as far back as the beginning of the 200s, maybe the mid 200s. So around that time. And they did it based on their own calculations. They thought Jesus would die on the same day he was conceived. Mm-hmm. This was an early idea that prophets had to die on the same day they were conceived. Okay. Is that true? Probably not, but that was their belief. Okay. So they thought Jesus died on March 25th. Just count forward 9 months, you get December 25th. That's why they were celebrating Christmas on December 25th. It had nothing to do with paganism. That's what the early work suggests. None of them suggest paganism. And again, we don't have any evidence of a pagan holiday on December 25th prior to 354 AD. There's nothing in the Julio-Claudian fasti inscriptions. Pliny the Elder doesn't mention it. Columella doesn't mention it. We don't really see it anywhere, to be honest. What happens is in 354 AD, there's something called the Philocalian calendar. And it says on December 25th, there were 30 games ordered for the birthday of the unconquered one. And most scholars think that's a reference to the sun, Sol Invictus, being worshipped on December 25th. But it's odd we don't see this holiday prior to Constantine. And so what some scholars suggest is that once Christianity, took over, they started celebrating their holidays. Constantine converted, so they had a lot more power. Pagans placed their own holiday on December 25th to compete with the Christians who were already using that date. So that's why we start seeing it after 354 AD. We start seeing it in, places like Macrobius, or in places like the Philocalian calendar, and St. Epiphanius mentions something going on in Egypt. But it all happens after Constantine. So it seems pagans actually moved a holiday or put one on that date to compete with the Christians who were already using that date. Because again, before Constantine, we have no reference to any holiday on that date.
What was the Whip? Were you going to ask a question?
December 25th, the shortest solstice day. You use the phrase "conquered one." Mm-hmm. Can you repeat that part?
This is in the Philocalian calendar. This is like an early calendar. It mentions different holidays, different celestial events. And what it says is on December 25th, there were 30 games ordered for the birthday of the unconquered one. And most scholars think this is a reference to Sol, the sun deity of Rome. What he's basically saying is that on the 25th, 30 games are going to be held in celebration of the birthday of the sun.
Yeah, because that's on that day, the solstice, which would be the winter solstice, so it's the shortest one. Mm-hmm. Then the sun is conquered. That's that reference, and that's why that link is there, right?
Well, it's the idea that they're celebrating the birthday of the sun. They're definitely celebrating the birthday of the sun in the 4th century.
Well, I mean, that's the way I always heard it as, like, and I never actually heard the conquered one phrase, but it just fits with that being the shortest day, the sun being conquered by the night, and then
it doesn't,
every day after that.
It doesn't say conquered one; it says unconquered. So 30 games ordered for the unconquered one.
It does make a certain kind of sense that you would celebrate the sun on a short day, though, to let the sun god know.
Because he's coming back, because that's the last one. And after that, he's coming back. He's unconquered.
Mm-hmm. It makes a certain kind of sense.
I'm just going to flip-flop and pretend I was on this side the whole time. Let's move on.
What's interesting is that before Constantine, there's different dates for the solstice. So the calendar of Antiochus places it on the 22nd. He was like a Greek astrologist. Pliny the Elder.
Because we changed the damn calendar. Like, we call it the 25th, but we're on a different calendar. We changed dates.
Yeah, but I'm going on the Julian calendar. The Julian calendar does place the solstice on the 25th, but Antiochus places it on the 22nd. Pliny the Elder placed it on the 26th. Columella on the 23rd. So a lot of early different writers didn't agree on the solstice. They weren't really sure of the date. However, none of them mention any festival on that date. None of them mention any sort of celebrations or games being celebrated. We only get that after Constantine.
Right, and so even though it makes sense, it doesn't correlate to Christmas because it didn't come until after Christmas had already been established.
Think of it like this. Even if there was a major holiday on that date, that doesn't mean the Christians selected it because of paganism. They're doing their own calculations. Pagans have a lot of gods. They have a lot of holidays to honor those gods. So the Christians, what do they have to literally scour Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, Greece, North Africa, Norse gods, the Celtic gods. All right, guys, we have determined that there are about 12 days of the year there are no pagan holidays on. We'll make sure we put our holidays on those days. Just right. Ridiculous. Okay, they're doing their own calculations regardless of what the pagans do. So even if there was a major holiday on December 25th, it wouldn't matter because the Christians picked that date because of their own reasons, not because of paganism.
Around that time, wasn't the church like highly persecuted, and didn't they practice mostly in secret?
Prior to Constantine, yes, there was something called the Diocletian persecution, which was probably the worst one since Nero. And the Christians were heavily persecuted. A lot of their sacred texts were burned. Their buildings were burned. Their property that a lot of Christians had was taken away from them, given to others. Constantine reversed some of that, which is, why he was a saint. And not as bad as, Hollywood makes him out to be. He did some bad things, but he did some good things as well. But yeah, there was something called the Diocletian persecution that really was bad. And it was just before Constantine. He put an end to that.
My question was because if I was forced to practice in secret, I would have my holy days on everyone else's holy days too.
That's a good point. Yeah,
because everybody said, "What? I'm buying a thing for the thing that everybody does."
I think it does go to the point though that if you swing a dead cat, you're going to hit a pagan holiday.
Then, that's probably actually
there's a
pagan holiday is the cat swinging.
Right? Who swings dead cats? It's such a weird phrase. Sorry, I even brought it up.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting to me, and you brought it up a few minutes ago, is there were pagan holidays that tried to compete with Christmas, with other Christian holidays. And one of the things that I found really fascinating when I was looking into not this particular topic, but when I was looking into like Krampus and all of that stuff, is there are claims that Krampus was far before Christmas, and it's an ancient thing, and it's this ancient pagan holiday. And then I was watching a PBS documentary, not some esoteric thing. And one of the things that they said was that that idea was actually written by German socialists in Germany to get at Christmas. Mm-hmm. Like it was specifically folklorist propaganda against Christians.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate there. I saw on the Smithsonian's website that Krampus was originally the son of the god Hel. Now, if you know anything about Norse mythology, that's wrong because Hel was not a god. Hel was a goddess.
Yes.
So you can't. So they're getting that wrong. Right. But no, there's nothing in Norse mythology that mentions Krampus. Krampus is the devil. That's why he looks like medieval depictions of the devil. He just sort of came out as like a demon that St. Nicholas like captured and forced to help him. He's not anything beyond that. He's a Catholic depiction of the devil. You could say it's influenced from paganism because depictions of the ancient Greek god Pan influenced depictions of the devil. But that's indirect like reference there. That's not meant to be taking from paganism so that we can repurpose it. No, that's just a long time ago, indirectly, depictions of pagan deities like Pan influenced depictions of the devil. Centuries later, Krampus comes out. I mean, what are you going to do?
Well, that's what's so funny to me is when I hear these arguments, which I'd love to go to the next one that you have on your mind after this. But when I see these arguments, so many are stating things as well-known fact that you can very clearly find documents behind it proving that it was not that at all. So like Krampus in particular, we know from history and letters and documentation that it was made up by socialist folklorists. We know that. And they tried to tie it into Hel, which, like you said, calling Hel a god is wild because, she's Loki's daughter and she's half alive, half dead. It's Norse mythology is wild and kind of one of the more fun ones of all of them, if I'm being honest. But you can completely discredit it with a basic search, and that's what's crazy about this. But what's like the next big thing that comes up? Because December 25th, we talked about trees. You said that they didn't start coming around until the 1500s. I want to say, from what I've read, was it Queen Victoria who really brought them into prominence? But before it was a Lutheran tradition in Germany.
It was mostly a German custom. It comes out of Alsace, France, which is in France now, but it was a German region about 500 years ago. And like the first ever mention comes from 1561, which is an Alsace ordinance declaring the height you can have of a Christmas tree. We don't really have anything that goes beyond or past that. That is the earliest mention of the Christmas tree, 1561. Okay, so this is long after paganism has died out.
I want to know about the guy in 1560 who ruined tall Christmas trees for everybody and what he did to instigate a law.
That's a good question.
about it.
It'd be very interesting to know. But yeah, people were probably just getting too big of Christmas trees, cutting down a lot of them, putting them in buildings that they couldn't really support. Who knows? But yeah, the first one is when they started limiting the size of it. So obviously it was a tradition in that region for how long, we don't know. Let's just say 60 years. Probably not even that long, because obviously rules and regulations come in quite quick when a custom catches on. So if we're being a little bit more reasonable, I would say the Christmas tree before that was probably only around maybe 20 years, maybe 30 years, if we're being charitable there. I mean, it wasn't that old, because eventually the government's going to come in and start regulating things. So that's the first mention of the Christmas tree. Prior to that, we don't really know the origin. There are some legends. Some attribute it to Martin Luther. Some will attribute it to a legend of Saint Boniface, because he was cutting down a sacred oak tree. And when he wasn't killed by lightning,
right?
Yeah. When he wasn't killed at the end, he pointed to the fir tree and said it's the symbol of Christ. That's a legend. We're not sure if that's accurate. Most scholars that try to pick the most reasonable explanation will say it probably came from a Christmas or from a Christian tradition, because in the Middle Ages, they often performed Adam and Eve plays or various plays throughout the year, because they didn't have YouTube or anything, so they did plays. On December 24th every year, they would perform an Adam and Eve play, because that was the feast day of Adam and Eve. Now, if you're going to perform an Adam and Eve play, you need a tree to represent the paradise tree, but not a lot of trees are alive in that time, except for the fir trees. So you grab one of them, they would decorate it with apples, and then they think that's just how the Christmas tree got associated with the Christmas celebration the next day. It morphed from paradise trees in Adam and Eve plays. So Christmas tree is entirely Christian in origin.
Yeah, so what was so funny was when I was watching that documentary, which I can barely call it that. One of the claims that he made was that we decorate the Christmas trees with ornaments because those are the god Tammuz's balls.
Yeah, that's, oh boy. It's like, where do you even start with how wrong that is? No, we don't.
I also think it's no. I was just going to say, and you would think that if pagans worship trees and love trees, they would worship them in a way that didn't kill them and put them in their house. I mean, that's logical, right? That's not crazy to think, right? If you really worship something and think it's sacred, you don't cut it down and let it die, right? Am I crazy for making that connection in my head? Who does that?
I mean, if you're going to make an idol out of it, sure. But I mean, if you're worshiping the actual living thing, you probably wouldn't. Pagans did have sacred groves for sure, but they were sacred groves. Go in and cut a tree down in there would have been, sacrilegious. There's a legend of Saint Martin at one point who went into a sacred grove to try to cut down the sacred trees there, because he doesn't want the pagans worshiping them, and they would have tried to stop him. But the earliest ornaments were actually apples. This is what Tanya Golovich, the scholar, notes. Again, connecting back to the paradise tree.
Tree of life, which is another point. When they use they said that you can't use the sun because obviously you're worshiping the sun god. It's the same thing with the trees, or they'll show the world tree. Mjolnir, not Mjolnir. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. The world tree in Norse mythology, and they'll say, "Oh, I've heard someone say, oh, that's what that is that we bring in as Christmas trees. It's the world tree from Norse mythology." And I'm like, are there not more important trees within our own religion that we would point to before we would be like, oh yeah, Norse?
Yeah,
it's Mildredresser or something.
Yggdrasil, that's right. Thank you.
Yggdrasil, thanks.
Yeah. The well, if anything, the world tree would have been an oak, because from what we can gather from early sources is that the oak was sacred to Odin and sacred in Norse, not the fir tree or pine tree.
Well, and it's funny that you just mentioned two separate saints that were known for cutting trees down in against pagan peoples and pagan customs, and they were hated for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would so I don't see. It's hard for me to steel man this. Are you able to steel man this at all?
No, because it's crazy. It's absolutely, I mean, a lot of their stuff they just sort of make up off the top of their head, and they just make connections based on what they think is going on, but they really don't know what's going on.
Like the Pope's hat.
Right. Well, that comes from Alexander Hislop as well. They'll say the Pope's mitre comes from the worship of the ancient fish deity Dagon. Problem, a lot of problems there. First of all, we don't have any depictions of Dagon and he wasn't a fish deity. He was a grain deity. That came about in the Middle Ages because the Jewish commentator Rashi associated him with the Hebrew word for fish, which is dag. So Dagon, dag, oh, it must be a fish deity. Well, he wasn't. He was a grain deity. And the Pope's mitre didn't come around, I think, till like the 900s or so. Any depictions you'll see of Dagon as a fish deity online are either depictions of Atargatis, which is a different goddess, or they're pictures of this Apkallu creature from the temple of Ninurta in Assyria. We don't have depictions of Dagon as a fish deity. Yeah, Apkallu.
We talked about Apkallu last week.
Oh yeah, sometimes they're depicted with like a fish hatter or something like that. Fish outfit.
So what is the next big thing? Because I'm trying to think of the dumb things I've heard.
Well, Santa Claus, we'll try that one.
Oh, well, and what's funny about that is they go down this Santa Claus route as if that's like see my boy Santa.
I got Santa here. Got it.
But they try to go down the Santa Claus route as if that's like seminal to the Christian liturgy of Christmas. It's like what all Christians do at Christmas. My parents never told me Santa was real.
Yeah,
they didn't lie to me, and I figured it out pretty quick. But like that in my case, and in a lot of cases of people that I knew, they didn't tell their kids that Santa was real. It's just a game, if anything. But yeah, I just don't see how they use that as a. I don't get it.
They'll say he's a pagan deity.
Right.
They'll say, so if you go to like Scandinavia, they don't have Santa Claus. They have Joulupuki, who is actually the name of a pagan deity. And they'll be like, see, Santa came from Joulupuki or Odin or Thor. He's just a Christianized version of that. Here's the problem, is that the origin of the Joulupuki figure as a Santa figure goes back to 1927 when a radio broadcaster, Marcus Radio, took St. Nicholas legends he got from America and blended them with Joulupuki or Finnish, history, and basically blended St. Nicholas with paganism there. But prior to that, St. Nicholas is entirely Christian in origin. Came from Santa Claus, modern Santa Claus, came from Dutch immigrants in New York throughout the 1800s. They were still venerating the Catholic saint, even though they were in the Protestants at this point. They still liked the gift-giving saints. So they sort of rebranded him, dressed him in the traditional attire of a Dutchman from that day, which was a big red suit, and said he's a gift-giving saint. They moved him to the North Pole because at that time the North Pole was still very mysterious. And so that's where it all comes from. They sort of invented the Santa Claus legend back then. People like Thomas Nash did this. And so Santa Claus is just a Catholic saint that's been sort of Americanized, if you want to. Call it what it is. That's what's going on.
The classic Coca-Cola Santa Claus actually has a lot to do with a poem by an Episcopal minister. And I had to look up his name while you were talking, but it's Clement Clark Moore.
Yeah, Clement Moore.
He wrote a poem called An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, which is kind of what developed into 'Twas the Night Before Christmas.
Yeah,
and
Clement
the Coca-Cola company,
one. Yeah.
The Coca-Cola company took and ran with this and basically created what we all know and love today as Santa Claus.
Yeah. They Santa was basically the Dutch immigrants, and then Coca-Cola picked it up and really popularized it quite well. Mm-hmm. So that's how Santa came about. It's basically a Catholic saint, Americanized, and then corporate America really started exporting it around the world.
Well, I mean, and Saint Nicholas, I mean, he has some wild stories. We talked about him last year. But there's some wild stories about him raising children from being dead in pickle brine and slapping Arius. Like, I mean, there's like Santa Claus, I think, would be so much more interesting if they kept in the slapping of Arius. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, he probably didn't. It's not mentioned in any of the early history, but yeah,
right.
It's just another one of the legends about him. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Do you think it's primarily just sort of like a anti-Catholicism that drives this desire to cancel Christmas?
Yes,
because it's a strain. I remember reading an account from Oliver Cromwell of wanting to cancel Christmas because of these kind of things, and so it's just purely we don't like the Catholics, and since the Catholics do this, we're going to say that it's a bad thing.
That's where a lot of it comes from. That's where
Wow.
just a lot of it comes from. I mean, that's why the Puritans were against it. They thought it was a pagan holiday because they considered the Catholic Church pagan. So they thought the Catholics took some sort of pagan holiday and tried to Christianize it, but they were vehemently anti-Catholic to begin with. But yeah, a lot of it comes from a lot of the propaganda that people use today comes from Protestant propaganda, people trying to attack the Catholic Church. But it's just not accurate when you go into the actual history of Christmas.
Right.
Go ahead.
It's interesting that in the country that is so, like, we are the place where Puritanism and Protestantism was able to sort of like spread its wings for all the better and worse parts of that. And we sort of took this Catholic saint and made it into an icon of our culture, because there are people who are not even Christian for whom Santa Claus is a near and dear figure. He's so iconic. And it's interesting that for all of the desire to crush Christmas, they made it bigger.
Yeah, Christmas is just a fun holiday anyway. You give gifts. It's at the end of the year celebration. There's a lot of fun customs with it, so it's going to thrive and keep going around. Despite how many legalists and Torah observant Christians out there want to destroy it, it's not going to happen anytime soon.
It's also cold, and it's crappy outside. And I think that putting the lights up really has a lot to do with avoiding seasonal affected depression, whatever it's called. Mm-hmm. People didn't know that it was called that, but they knew that they got sad in the wintertime. And so they started lighting candles and putting bright things up to make themselves feel better. That's my own personal theory, but we had like 10 days of rain in a row, and then everybody started putting their Christmas lights up, and I was like, this is okay. This is better.
So Santa Claus is there's some girl on TikTok, I can't remember her name. She calls herself a folklorist, and I scrolled past her video today about how Santa Claus is a pagan god.
Yeah,
he's an American pagan god, and I'm like, sort of, but who's worshiping at the altar of Santa Claus?
Well, they just want to make it more
MasterCard.
Well, most people who get trampled in a Black Friday sale are probably sacrificed on the altar of Santa Claus. I don't know what you want to call it.
That's good, Whip.
Thanks, buddy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Freaking Santa Claus.
Yeah.
So what have we covered Santa Claus sufficiently, do you think, Mike?
I think so. People will make sensationalist claims that it's a pagan deity because they want it to be more interesting than it is.
Yeah.
And so that's what typically happens.
I don't know that it's necessarily at this point in 2022. I don't know that Santa, that hat you're wearing is necessarily a pagan deity so much as it is just a representation of the outgrowth of commercialism that has been pushed to support the oligarchy. Like, everything in our life is fed to us and whatever. And that hat is known around the world for a time to spend some fucking money. And also, maybe you get to hang out with your family if you're lucky enough to live close to them. Who knows? So
I actually see it in a little bit of a different way, if you don't mind. Because its origins are the bishop's cap, it, to me, symbolizes how strongly Christianity has affected the bedrock of our culture. And it permeates many of the things that we do without even being aware of it. So even if they were to ban the practice, which could happen again, it was once illegal to be Christian, it could become that way again. Even if
who went to church over in 2020? I couldn't go to church and be a Christian on Sunday just a year and a half ago. It was against the law.
Fair enough. But what I'm saying is that it has affected all these little bits of the culture so much so that you could never fully pull it away.
Sure.
And I actually find that quite comforting. And
that's a good one.
It's a different symbol to me, I think.
So let me move on to another one that I just thought of, which is that kissing under the mistletoe is a holdover from Roman, I think it was Roman, orgies, where they would have orgies under the
Wow.
mistletoe.
That's an escalation.
Do you know of? Have you
A
dealt with this?
de-escalation.
Yeah, there is no evidence that they were doing orgies under the mistletoe.
That's
there's
mistletoe to orgies in like 90 seconds.
There's just no ancient text that mention this. It's just, again, made up. It's people say kissing under the mistletoe. Well, why is that's a weird custom? It's not in the Bible. Well, maybe we know pagans liked nature. They like things in nature, and they like kissing and sexual activities. Maybe if we just extrapolate, there was these sexual activities happening with the mistletoe, and Christians just try to downplay it so much, just kiss or something. So that's typically where the idea comes from. It's just crap. Mistletoe is a weed. What we know about it is that Pliny the Elder tells us that the Gauls in France, the Druids there, if they found it on an oak any time of the year, not just at winter, but any time, it was considered sacred. They thought it could cure animal fecundity. They thought it could cure disease. That's basically it. So it was sacred if it was found on an oak. Okay. Fast forward, hundreds of years, we start seeing mistletoe be used as a decoration in the 1600s. Robert Herrick mentions it in his poetry collection. The tradition of kissing under the mistletoe doesn't seem to have come about until the late 1700s, and it seemed to just come from like a de novo practice or custom from the servant class in Britain. They just started doing it. Someone probably just kissed under the mistletoe, and it just became a tradition. I mean, that's typically how these things start. De novo, basically, sometime in the late 1700s. No evidence it goes back to paganism.
So kissing under the mistletoe could be a meme that's just lasted for a really long time.
Basically, that's what it is. Yeah.
Right.
That's so can you think of any of the claims that they make that you would say, hey, they're right. This is something that was pagan that Christians recontextualized?
I thought mistletoe was tied to the Druids.
Well, did the Druids even exist?
Held mistletoe like super.
Yeah, but aren't the Druids like all kinds of tied to different plants? So again, if you swing a dead cat, you're going to hit a plant that a Druid likes.
Well, also, aren't Druids isn't there like nothing that we actually know about them? Like there's such little writing about what the Druids did and believed, and like do we know anything about Druids?
No,
reality?
I watched that show Britannia on BBC One. I know everything there is to know.
I read every single Captain Britain comic book, so I am an expert on Merlin. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
We don't know much about the Druids. They didn't leave any writings behind, so everything comes from secondhand sources. Like Julius Caesar wrote about them in his own personal works. Mistletoe, again, as I mentioned, Pliny the Elder said that the mistletoe was sacred to the Druids of Gaul. They thought it was sacred. They found it on an oak. That was important, though. So, yeah, it was just a plant that grew, and sometimes different people thought it was sacred. But again, the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe comes much later. And it's just they started decorating churches and buildings with mistletoe because in the winter you don't have a lot of color. Mistletoe can give a little bit of color, so they're going to use what is available. And then at some point, the tradition of kissing under it came about later. I mean, that's basically the way it works.
We're humans.
That's what I'm saying about the lights.
We like kissing.
I think that's just an instinctual human thing when it starts to get dark. And I think people are reading way too much into it and saying, oh, this is pagan worship of this, that, and the other. It's like, no, bro, it's dark outside and it's sad. And we just want to brighten the place up. Chill out.
One of the things that I've heard used as a argument against Christmas is that gift giving itself on Christmas is pagan.
Yeah.
I can't remember I don't know if it was a god or what, but that a god would leave gifts out on the bottom of a tree, and that's where we got the concept of giving gifts. Have you heard this before?
Yeah, it's absolute crap. It's not accurate at all. So Christmas presents, so they'll say things like that. They'll say gift giving came from Saturnalia because there was gift giving during the festival of Saturnalia, which started on December 17th in ancient Rome. Here's what we need to remember. Okay, gift giving is common to all human cultures. It's a common human custom. Gift giving happens on Valentine's Day. It happens on birthdays. Kids get Easter gifts sometime. I mean, gift giving is, you can count Halloween candy as a gift. Gift giving happens a lot. There are wedding gifts, funeral gifts. I mean, like, gifts just happen. So it's such a general custom. Can we really say that like the Christians were like, oh, we really want to steal this custom from Saturnalia and use it? I mean, maybe that's just what humans like to do on holidays. Is that just a possibility? And we don't really see gift giving associated with Christmas until much, much later. Again, it really started to get popular worldwide in the 1800s. Same when St. Nicholas was getting popular as the gift giving saint. Because originally, children would get gifts on St. Nicholas Day, which I think was December 7th or the 6th. Adults would exchange gifts on New Year's. And those customs just went to Christmas. We start seeing Christmas gifts go back to like Germany in like the 1600s, 16th century, I mean. So that's really when we start to see it. And it just didn't get popular till the 1800s. But yeah, I mean, gift giving just seems to have been a popular human custom that was around that time of the year anyway. And so when Christmas started to get more popular, you just started giving gifts on Christmas because, again, it's just what humans like to do.
And hasn't birthday gifts and celebrating births always come with some measure of gift giving? Like I remember seeing stuff early on in history of people giving gifts on birthdays. Why wouldn't we give gifts on Jesus's birthday?
Well, I mean, we could just say the custom came from the Magi that brought gifts to Jesus to celebrate his birthday.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Why can't that be where it comes from for the Christians? Why does it have to come from Saturnalia or the Norse mythology? Like, this is how desperate a lot of these people get. They need to find some pagan connection. So they go to gift giving and singing. It's like, really, Christians couldn't come up with that on their own. They have to steal it from pagans.
That was actually the next one I was going to bring up, that there were the wassailing comes from the Anglo-Saxon phrase of was hail, meaning good health. Every year, wassailers would roam through their village in small groups, singing loudly with the aim of banishing evil spirits and wishing good health to those around them. And so St. Francis took inspiration from them and started Christmas caroling.
Yeah, you really got to stretch to make that up.
Okay, here's a thought though. So what? But what if that is where that it comes from?
So this is what Tanya Golovich says about wassailing. The English word wassail comes from the Middle English phrase washail, which meant be whole or be healthy. The contemporary English word hail, meaning sound, healthy or vigorous, evolved from the second word in the phrase. Medieval Britons toasted each year with the cry wes heal. The proper response was drink heal, which means drink wholeness or drink health. The phrase first appears in the context of 12th century document. Okay? That's the first time we hear it. This doesn't go back to paganism again.
That's what's so. Have you found? So you said they're so desperate to find these things, and that's what I found as well. Have you perceived a reason as to why? I mean, besides the hating Catholics thing, is because some of these people, it isn't about hating Catholics. It's about hating the rest of Christianity, all of Christianity outside of these specific sects.
I think it has something to do with just trying to find meaning where there really isn't sometimes. I mean, kissing under the mistletoe is just a custom. It doesn't go back to anything different. But humans don't like that. Everything has to happen for like a very interesting reason. So they want to, they're like, there's no Christmas trees. There's no mistletoe in the Bible. Where do these things come from? Well, they have to have come from somewhere, and there had to be some sort of really important meaning behind them. So maybe they came from paganism. That's just what humans tend to do. We see something and we want to know. It just sometimes it just cannot be some de novo custom that came out of English folklore or European folk traditions. It had to have come from something more important because it can't just be that simple. But sometimes it is, and that's what people don't want to hear.
I agree with that very much. I don't see a problem in a tradition that comes from a pagan culture being kept if it's not kept with the intent of communing with spirits or gods that you don't believe in, probably don't know the name of, and worship comes from your heart. You have to be expressing the intent there. So the idea that putting up a plastic Christmas tree in your house with lights on it is somehow communing with ancient gods is wild. That's a wild stretch.
Well, let me ask you, because you were talking about how they all want these things to have lasted for centuries and have this very important reason. And I know this is going to sound like a stupid question, but when do you think the high five was invented? If you had to guess.
I have no clue when that was invented. Again, probably English folk or European folk custom.
I mean, obviously it's a
possibly.
pagan tradition, but in reality, apparently the first high five was in 1977.
Interesting. I did not.
Generally accepted that was the first real high five. Isn't that? I've read that more than once, and I mean, I'm not going to say that no one slapped hands together before that moment, because obviously people have been slapping their hands together since the beginning of time. But what we think of as a high five didn't come around until 1977. And so
I mean, it makes sense. And then notice I said maybe it's a European folk tradition, thinking it goes back a couple hundred years, because generally the mind just wants to think it's older than it really is sometimes. Like it's got to be something that's been around for a long time, but not always the case.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what's funny is when you were saying that, I was like, I remember that it's not as old as you'd think it is. This is a perfect illustration of this principle.
Wow.
But here's a question.
Fact check true, Cam. Fact check true.
Here's a question, Mike. Can you worship a pagan god on accident?
I would be very interested to see how that would even be possible. How do you accidentally worship a pagan deity if you're not trying to? Like it's like this. Like let's say like I bowed before a tree to tie my shoe, but 2,000 years ago, this was the very spot of some sort of ancient Native American site that honored their pagan deities. Did I worship those deities? No, I'm tying my shoe. It's all about intent. If I were to stop and tie my shoe and then I look up and notice there's a statue of Buddha there, like I was maybe traveling through India or something, I did not accidentally worship Buddha. I just went down to tie my shoe. So we got to use some common sense here when it comes to this. People are not accidentally worshiping pagan deities, even if Christmas customs go back to paganism, because they don't mean that to us. Same with like 1 Corinthians 8. Just because a meat was sacrificed to idol, that doesn't mean you're actually worshiping that idol if you eat the meat.
Can I ask you maybe like a probing question into that? Say it goes further than that, where it is actually attached to a pagan custom, like knocking on wood, for example. I knock on wood because that's something my dad did. It may originally at some point have come from a pagan custom where you were entreating the tree to bring the god to you or whatever it may have been, but that's not why I did it. I do it because my dad did it, and he did it because his dad did it, and on and on and on back. Yes, its origins are pagan, but the intent, as you said, is not there. So I think even when it is, you can point at some historical pagan origin, doing the practice doesn't necessarily mean you have intent toward a pagan god, which you may or may not be aware of.
Yeah, I think Stephen Rhodes said it goes back to like the 17th century, though. So I don't know if it even goes back to paganism. But yeah, to you doesn't mean the same thing. And that's important. Like knocking on wood for you is just, it's just a custom. It doesn't refer to anything pagan. But I don't. Some of these people are so paranoid. Some of these legalists, they're so paranoid that they're going to accidentally offend God by like knocking on wood or putting a present under a pine tree. Like, what sort of God do you worship that's so insecure that he actually is worried about that? Like, that's ridiculous.
And who's worshiping their Christmas tree? Like, I mean, like you said, intent matters. I mean, I was talking to someone not that long ago, and they were like, well, if you bow down to the tree when you get out the gifts and just the same thing you were talking about with, and I was just like, what part of the liturgy in Catholicism, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and any Protestant has a specific point where we worship the tree? Because it's not a part of worship at all. It's a declaration.
I mean, that's what the legalists do. They jump to irrational conclusions because they.
Okay. So I got the legalist here. If I hacky sack the present from the ground into my hand with my knee, I'm not technically bowing before the tree. So checkmate. We can just proceed with Christmas now and not have to worry about it.
Hey, can I jump in on the other side real quick? Because I want to just touch on, Jess, I really liked your analogy of the knocking on wood, because that would actually be an example of a carryover from a past tie-in to something, versus I'm taking a walk and I tie my shoe and I look up and there's a Buddha, so I've inadvertently bowed. I don't know that and there was another one, and they both involved like just randomly taking a walk and then tying my shoe and looking up, and I guess I bowed to someone. That feels less like a solid analogy than what Jess presented, because Jess can actually argue the intent point, whereas like, because you're actually doing a thing on the thing, and whether you acknowledge that that piece of wood has a spirit or energy or life force or whatever inhabiting it, despite whether or not you're acknowledging it, like that's just a more solid than the tying my shoe. But
but they're not
one
making,
thing I wanted to say was that, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but you're right, but they're not making even that argument. What the argument that they're making is that by bending down and picking up a present, you are bowing to a tree. So hers is, her argument is stronger than theirs.
Dumb. I'm sorry, that's rude.
I know,
it's dumb.
but that's what a guy I debated called Zach Bauer. He's a Torah observer. I debated him on his channel a couple of years ago on this, and one of the things that sparked it is he said in one of his videos that if you put a present under that fir tree, you're bowing to that fir tree. And I made the point like, okay, so if I puke in a toilet, am I bowing to the toilet? And he's like, well, there's no toilet deities. Well, I found out later there are.
No, there totally are, and yes, you are.
Yeah,
but here's the thing: you're both right, except he's a grammar Nazi, religious observant grammar Nazi, or whatever. Like, okay, you're technically committing the act of bowing over, and so you can argue the intent point. So, and especially coming from someone who's a Torah scholar or Torah observer.
No,
like,
he's not a scholar, let me tell you.
I mean, okay,
Let's not throw the word scholar around now.
But I'm just saying, like, someone like that's like, it seems to me as a Baptist that religion seems like it has a lot of rules that people got to pay attention to, and they really seem to like to talk about those rules a whole lot.
It's almost like there was some guy who came because the rules were too hard for everyone to follow perfectly, so that we didn't have to follow the rules perfectly anymore.
Sure. So then, before we get away from it, I just wanted to touch and try to play the other side again. So if like we're talking about different gods, and you're talking about like, okay, so there's like 12 days where different gods aren't being whatever. So that, they just happen to be on the same thing. And so if we put a present in front of a tree, then we're not, the intent isn't that we're worshiping the tree. However, if gods in the ancient world, as I've heard, it seemed to all be tied to different things. One's a grain god, one's a sun god, one's a water god, and there's all of those things are just different energy states. Like, as our planet travels around, we are subject to different energy flows from the galaxy that we are in. And like within the great cycle of 20-something thousand years, like those flows repeat. And so the old astrology that paid attention to that and attributed feast days and days of worship to different things, like that's where they were coming at that from, as I've heard it. So
I see what you're saying. It's like a historical long-term observance, right?
Right. It's more like people are doing something on that day, and whether or not they give a shit about the old thing, whether or not they're knocking on wood or whatever, there's still that love, there's still the family, there's still the worship, whether or not it's pointed at Yahweh or whoever, it's still a feeling of worship on that communal day that would be tied to that old deity's energy signature.
Yeah,
got off in the weeds on that.
I would not see that as any sort of problem, even if that's the case. And that's not the case with Christmas,
sure,
or any major holiday. But I mean, even if it is, like, I would treat it like 1 Corinthians 8, like, just because maybe this piece of meat was used to honor a pagan deity, and now it's being sold at the market, that doesn't mean it's a problem. Just because a pagan may have made this sacred for their deity in the past, that doesn't mean it's wrong for you to partake with, as long as you're not causing someone to stumble, of course. So I don't really see that as a problem, because I think Paul makes it very clear that just because a pagan may have done something in the past with meat or trees, you name it, that doesn't mean it's going to be wrong for us to do it now, because for us, it's just meat. It has nothing to do with Zeus or whoever it was sacrificed to.
Right.
Yeah, I love catfish.
Their belief in it doesn't transfer any property to the object. Their belief is erroneous. It doesn't exist. The only way that it transfers anything to that object is if you believe that their gods have some sort of power.
Well, I think even Jesus said that those gods all have power. Their power doesn't compare to his power. I mean, even he called them gods.
Yeah, I use the word Elohim is kind of a general word used for spiritual beings.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, by the way, it's bringing up 1 Corinthians 8 is such an important chapter, because that's the chapter that any in the Torah observant community ignore, because I mean, it's very clear that there was a Judaizing problem going on, and they were trying to. Paul was like, okay, so you feel like this is wrong for you to do. If you are convinced that this is wrong, that this is a sin, don't do it, because if you're convinced it's a sin and you do it anyway, you are sinning. But if you're not, if you do not believe it is a sin and you do it, you are not sinning, because our intent matters. And he made that very clear. But it's just wild to me, Mike, how so, like, if you look at TikTok, Twitter, whatever, if you look at the kind of general internet zeitgeist when it comes to Christian stuff, is the same freaking heresies from the first century are the ones that are still here: Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and Judaizing. How is that a thing? How is this still a thing 2,000 years later?
Well, my theory is because Jesus hasn't returned, and so Christians, instead of doing what Jesus commanded, love one another, spread the gospel. That's what you need to do. Well, maybe we haven't gotten the way to worship him right. It's not as clear in the New Testament, I guess.
Right.
I think it's pretty freaking clear. Spread the gospel, love one another.
Worship
you don't
in
have to do
spirit and in truth.
Yeah, you don't have to do Judaizing stuff, but I mean, I think some people today think that maybe the reason why Jesus hasn't returned is because maybe we're not worshiping right. We need to get the church back on the right track and become this Jewish group for some reason. And that's just nonsense. I mean, I think right before it in 1 Corinthians 7, he says, was anyone at a time called of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision, for neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. So right then and there, Paul's telling the Gentiles, you don't have to become Jews. Okay, you're Gentile Christians. It's fine.
In fact, don't.
Be okay. Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't. There's I just was at ETS and I met two Messianic Jews. They're actually Jewish, not just pretending to be. They're actually of Jewish descent, and they get kind of annoyed with Torah observers. They said they're like, it feels like they're just like what Gentiles are not good enough. You have to become Jewish. And so to them, it comes a little offensive because they keep the Torah. They think Jewish Christians should keep the Torah, but they don't think Gentile Christians should. And I perfectly agree with them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even it does seem that Paul may have moved away from some of the Torah observance himself in different passages. So it's like, even so, that's kind of the danger of the Torah observant movement that I've noticed. I've had probably 3 or 4 people that I've known who went down that road. The trajectory went Torah observant, rejecting Paul, rejecting Messiah, becoming Jewish, and then just rejecting God altogether and becoming some weird hippy dippy. That's what I've noticed. I don't know if you've noticed the same thing, but I've seen a lot of people go from Torah observance to not Christians or even Jews anymore.
I've seen some, not all though. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law they still accept core doctrines like Trinity, but I've seen some Torah observers go pretty far. Like Jesus just becomes a man. He's no longer has the virgin birth. He's no longer the second person of the Trinity. He's just a Messiah figure. And that's scary to go down that road, because that's just, you're going into heresy at that point.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've noticed this on TikTok. I laugh every time I see it. There's one person who does it in particular, but there's several I've seen it, who they talk about how you have to use the correct names, which are the Hebrew names. And that's bad enough. I've responded to that enough. But they go, yeah, Yeshua or Yahweh. And then you have these other people who are calling, instead of saying Yahweh or any kind of academically accepted pronunciation of the divine name, they'll say Yahuwah, and instead of Yeshua, they'll say Yahusha. And I laugh every time.
God bless you.
Right? I laugh every time.
I'm Southern. I can't do that.
Yahusha. Every time, I think it sounds like we're sneezing.
I can't make the throat noises. There's a certain dialect with that I can't do. I can't roll my R's either.
Well, here's what's really stupid about that. Okay. Yeah. The New Testament was written in Greek. Right. So they already transliterated his Aramaic name, which would be probably Yeshu or Yeshua, into Greek, like Jesus. Okay. Yeah. So they didn't translate it, they transliterated it. They were trying to capture them to the way that it would have sounded, but in Greek. We do it today. Like we'll take like certain words that we may hear, like I'm trying to think of a good example of something that's been transliterated. Croissant. Yeah, there's a French word we just sort of transliterated. We don't just translate it as roll. We transliterate it croissant, like, as the way it would sound in that language. So when we hear Jesus or Jesus in the Greek New Testament, they're not translating his name. They transliterated his name the way it should sound in Greek from the Aramaic. So the New Testament, the sacred scriptures these Torah observers are going to use, already translated Jesus' name into Greek, or transliterated his name into Greek. So what's the problem? Okay, the Bible already transliterates his name into Greek. Why do you have to go back to the Aramaic name when the Bible doesn't even do that?
Let me just make a real quick point. Then yes, there was a woman who made a TikTok video about this the other day, and I just commented. I didn't want to make a video, didn't have the time to. But she was like, why am I calling him God, which is just a title, instead of Yahweh? Because that's what we should be using as the name. And I'm like, why do I call him Dad instead of Rick? Like,
it's a good point.
Like, these are both acceptable things to do. But you better be in close relationship with your dad if you want to call him by his first name. But the other one, why would I call him Jesus when his name was Yeshua? And I said, because that's how the apostles wrote his name. Right. Am I supposed to ignore what they did and listen to some 21st century Torah observer? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, they don't think. Well, they don't think. I mean, clearly it's in Greek. And, even if you reject Paul's letters, which is ridiculous, the Greek Gospels all write Jesus Christos, Jesus Christ. And then we just translate, and that just sort of like has been, morphed from Greek to Latin to then, Middle English now to English. So that's where it comes from. It's right. There's no problem there. Okay. Jesus is not offended in heaven because we're not saying Yeshu or Yeshua.
Or Jehovah, which the Mormons use that as the proper correct name for one of their versions of God, Jesus or God or his father. I can't remember which they use it for. Yeah. But they act like Jehovah is the correct word, as if it didn't go through some Germanic tongues before it came out with a hard J.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if they're going to go all out, they might as well also call him El, because in the Old Testament, God is not just called the divine name; He's also called El Shaddai, El Elyon. Yeah. So He's got these other names. He's got plenty of names in the Bible. El, the divine name, Hashem. I mean, which one are you going to use?
What were you going to say, Jessica? Sorry.
Okay, so I've sort of been listening to this and wondering to myself all along, where do you, and I don't mean you guys specifically, but I mean just sort of in general, in context of this argument, how far do you go to meet people where they live? That you can make ideas accessible to them with their own culture. At what point are you like violating something? unless you're outright saying a heresy, unless you're outright saying, you won't say that the Jesus is part of the Trinity or something like that. But otherwise, taking part in other people's cultures becomes the sin. It becomes the thing that you're doing wrong, essentially. Like, where does that fit in? Because aren't we called also to be evangelical and to spread the evangelion? It means the good news. Like, you want to take this good news to people. So isn't that, I guess that's why you have to reject Paul, because Paul is like, we're taking this thing worldwide. And that wasn't good enough for some people. They wanted it to remain an insular thing, I guess. Maybe I just answered my own question.
Well, one
you
girl.
Also have to reject Matthew, because Matthew ends with the Great Commission.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But that's the idea, right? Is that you go to people and you meet them where they live. So I've seen Japanese Christianity, for example, looks very different than Western Protestant influenced Christianity. Whereas Christianity in the East, in Asia, has been influenced by Antioch and Thessalonica and places like that. So it looks very foreign. And I think to a sort of an Americanized person who is spinning their wheels trying to be Torah observant would look at something like that, which is actually very close in some cultural ways to the early church, and reject it as foreign and pagan. And, at what point are you just sort of being a cultural bigot and saying, that my little way of doing things, this is the box that I've shoved God into, and he can't possibly be big enough to include somebody whose culture is quite different from mine? Does that make sense? Or am I just rambling?
No, it makes sense, because Torah observers think that the only way to serve Jesus is you got to think and act like them, which is just not what the early church taught. What's going on in Acts 15. These are Gentile Christians. They don't have to become Jewish Christians. We, the Jewish church, can still keep the Torah and serve God, but we're not going to force them to do as I do, because Christ is saving them. They have the Holy Spirit, and they don't need to do these things because Christ has told us to take this to the whole world. It's very hard for missionaries to keep, a kosher diet when you're traveling around the world and doing all sorts of things. I mean, it makes it really hard to get the gospel out. And I think that's why the early church, led by the Holy Spirit, didn't force this onto the Gentiles. It makes perfect sense.
I'm Orthodox, so prostration is part of our worship throughout the year. There are different times of the year where we're prostrate, and there are icons that sit at the front of our church. When we prostrate, we're not bowing to the wood and the paint and the things that are, beautifying the house of worship that we're in. The prostration is a tool of humility for our minds and our hearts. It's our have you guys heard of the concept of the church militant versus the church triumphant? It's humiliating your body, and humiliating is maybe the wrong word. It has a negative connotation, and I don't mean it to, but lowering your body so that you can raise your spirit. And there's an icon in front of me, because there's icons lining the front of the church. But when I'm prostrating, I'm not prostrating to a painting. That's sort of ridiculous. I don't know. But especially, that is the idea that I've heard tonight that I have found the most ridiculous and has made me bust out laughing every time I've heard it, because I actually prostrate. I actually bow down in my services, which is not something that most Protestant Americans do, as far as I understand. Mm-hmm. And so to hear something that's part of my Christian worship being perverted in this way, when it's such a beautiful tool for your spiritual progress, that makes me truly sad. And I hope that people won't see kneeling and prostrating as this whatever object happens to be in front of you is what you're giving your worship to, because that's
a Christmas tree,
not what prostrations are. And so that's my TED Talk. Thank you for coming.
So we're getting close to an hour and a half. So I figure we should probably start circling the wagons, ask some some final questions and then move on for patrons to the after party. So what are there any big claims that they make that we've missed in this episode?
They'll try Yule logs. They like to say Yule logs go back to paganism because they'll say that, it has the word Yule in it, therefore goes back to paganism. Problem is that Yule was not placed on December 25th until the Norse King Hakon the Good converted to Christianity and then put Yule on December 25th to coincide with Christmas. This is what Snorri Sturluson tells us. So Yule was not on December 25th prior to that, and it was placed on that date because Christmas was already in that date. But they'll say, but you borrowed Yule logs. Well, there's no evidence there was ever any sort of thing called a Yule log associated with the North holiday of Yule. Yule logs don't show up until the 1600s, and it's an English custom, not a Norse custom. We see that it was started to be used in Robert Herrick's poetry collection, but he calls it a Christmas log. And then later, John Aubrey refers to it as a Yule log. What scholars will note is Yule in English just means a midwinter period, and people were burning logs in the winter. And so there just became a midwinter log called a Yule log associated with Christmas. Again, another European folk tradition that does not go back to paganism. But yeah, nothing I can find, any major Christmas holiday goes back to any paganism whatsoever.
I've noticed a common trend every time you're sort of like rebutting these ideas. It all sort of comes back to the Victorians. And it seems like we're blaming pagans for things Victorians did. So if you're going to blame someone, blame the right people. And the Victorians can take it.
I mean, Victorians popularized a lot of these things. But I mean, a lot of them were Germanic or your English customs prior to that. They just started getting popular around then.
Yep. Was there anything else in the way of Christmas? Or do we hit it at all?
I can't think of anything. I think we got most of it all. If you want any more, I have a video called Top 10 Christmas Traditions and Their Origin Stories, where I cover basically everything we talked about and just give all the sources there.
Awesome.
Can you put a link to that in the thingy?
Well, I have a link to his YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect,
I also wanted to say, I didn't want to interrupt the topic at hand, but since we're coming to the end, before I was beginning to teach my Sunday school class for the first time this year, I became a Sunday school teacher, and the topic was Genesis. And I used quite a few of your videos to give me a lot of context that I don't have as a 21st century American. And I found them very edifying, and I definitely appreciated meeting you because I actually was a big fan before I had the opportunity for this encounter, which I jumped on. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Let's see. Whip, do you have any? Oh, here's a question. Whip brought up last night pine cones. And I don't remember what it was Jim Staley said about pine cones, but something about them being pagan.
Third eye pine cone worship, and then the giant pine cone in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's just utter nonsense. I can find no evidence that this stuff goes back to paganism. I mean, just because it looks like a pine cone, that doesn't mean it is a pine cone. People need to actually show sources. People don't have sources. They just make connections based on what they think is there.
Well, yeah. I actually had a problem with his interpretation of that because the pine cone was just supposed to represent the opening of the third eye chakra, whatever one that's called. It's this one here, the pineal gland. And when that by fluoride and calcified, it looks eerily like the pine cone that is then again represented a lot in old thingies, and it's like right here. It's like right where it would be, and that's how I've heard it referenced in reference to the Vatican. That's what it's there for.
I've not heard that at all.
That chakra.
I doubt it because they're not into chakras.
Maybe. I don't know. I've never been in that library.
I have.
There's a giant pine cone statue that decorates the wall of the Vatican.
That's what I'm talking about.
As we know, pine cones outside of your house is the international symbol of.
No, that's
swingers.
Pineapple.
That's pineapple. It's the pineapple. Never mind.
The Pope's not a swinger.
That one goes back to
I thought we uncovered some wild things tonight, but
No.
I had my pines mixed up. Sorry, guys.
I have one our big question for you at the end, but I did want to bring up two little things that I made notes on from that documentary, because I laughed my butt off when I heard them. One was he said, and I quote, "I only know," because he was talking about Santa coming through the chimney and through the fireplace, and he said, "I only know of one God that goes through fire, and that's Satan himself." And I go, wait. What about the God who spoke through fire in a burning bush to Moses, or maybe led through his Shekinah glory through the wilderness as a pillar of fire, or I don't know, the gift of the Spirit coming on as tongues of fire? What are you talking about, Jim? I just laughed because I was like, that's the dumbest thing
The
I've ever heard.
Transfiguration, the harrowing of hell. There's a bunch I could bring up too.
Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well.
Right? Yeah. I mean, so many have. It was so dumb. And then the final thing is he told everyone that they should be celebrating Hanukkah because Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, and he made a whole thing, which is funny because a lot of times I don't know if he's Torah observant. He did say Yeshua a few times.
He is a big Torah observer. That's one of his big shticks. Yeah, I'm not. That's what sort of got him on this whole thing. I'm definitely not convinced of that. But, that's his big thing. He's like, we should all be keeping the Torah, and I'm like, okay, Jim, whatever.
But like, here's my question, because a lot of the times he didn't say this, but a lot of times they'll say that you shouldn't celebrate Christmas because it was not a holiday instituted by the command of God, and those are the ones we are supposed to keep, right? Mm-hmm. They say that a lot.
But does it say specifically you can't celebrate any other holidays?
No. It just tells you holidays to keep. But that's the but that's the claim that they make. And then so I'm just wondering, are you consistent like a Jehovah's Witness and you're not celebrating birthdays? Why are you celebrating Hanukkah? I mean, that was not commanded. Like it just seems like the Torah observance is like, it's not even strong Torah observance based on their definitions.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue the festival of Purim came from some sort of ancient Persian festival. Well, not a festival, but an act of casting lots, and they just sort of took that because that's the time when the lots were cast in their favor as the basis of another holiday they created. And so that they're taking something that originally had some sort of pagan meaning. They built a whole Jewish festival called Purim, or I forget how to pronounce it. I always pronounce it wrong.
I think I've heard Purim. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Everyone pronounces everything wrong in the Bible, I feel like, especially people who say Yahusha.
God bless you.
God bless you.
But my final question is the one we ask everyone. Because when this show changed from what it was to what it is, Jessica and I decided actually that we needed to push hope. Because there were a lot of people during the last 2 years that have not felt like they've had any, and have been deeply depressed. And so one of the things that I ask every guest at the end is, what's something right now, it could be personal, local, global, whatever, any level, what's something right now that gives you hope and gives you the motivation to carry on, the silver lining to share with people?
Well, I mean, I think one of the best things, of course, is the fact that Christmas is celebrating the nativity. What's more important there is why Christmas we have it, and that's the nativity, that Christ came into this world. And people don't realize is that I have argued in one of my videos that this is Christ ending the exile, not the Babylonian exile, but the exile from Eden, because this is the first time God is actually dwelling with humans face to face as he wanted to. And not having to have any sort of special purity rituals where humans had to sort of do to come into his presence. And now humans can be with God the way he's always wanted to be. And that's what's so amazing about Christmas and why it should be celebrated.
Wonderful answer.
That's lovely. That's beautiful.
I want to say so much, but I won't. I will let you go. But before you go, I do want to make sure everyone knows where to find you. They can, of course, go to your website, InspiringPhilosophy.org. You're on Twitter at InspiringPhilos. Your YouTube.com/InspiringPhilosophy. And if you want to find him on TikTok or anywhere else, just type in the 2 words Inspiring Philosophy and smash those things together.
Basically it right there. Yeah.
Anything
You
else
said
you want to?
inspiring Philos
Yes, on
on
Twitter.
Twitter.
Yeah.
I'm gonna grab him. Right on, man.
Anything else you want to share with the audience before I let you go?
Nope. You can follow me on Instagram or Facebook as well. It's there as
Awesome.
well. But yeah, that's what I do.
It was a real pleasure.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much
Nice.
for
Super
coming
nice
on.
to meet you, Mike. Thanks
Yeah,
for
nice
coming,
meeting
man.
you all too. Yeah.
Thanks.
Merry Christmas.
See you later.
Yeah.
Merry Christmas. All right. So we are going in a minute. We're going to shift to the patrons only feed. And so if you're watching on the regular YouTube, we'll see you in a little. We'll see you later. But the rest of you, we'll see you. We'll keep seeing you. So that's exciting. But before we do that, I do want to let you know what's coming up. Next week, we're going to do our Christmas show, which is going to be purely a joyous occasion of me talking to my mom and Jessica. It's going to be a good
Mama
one.
Harless. She's the best.
God bless. God bless Cindy.
Yeah, so we're going to do that. I'm going to talk her into reading the Christmas book that she always read to us when we were kids. I don't know if I've made her do that before, but I think I'm going to make her do that.
I'm going to get all cozy for that. I'm going to bring a blankie and some hot chocolate, I think.
They made Die Hard a book?
Yeah, that's great. And my mom does the voice of Hans Gruber perfectly.
Awesome.
Oh, sweet.
But so that's what's next week. And after that, we're going to have our New Year's party, and I'll let you know what that entails very soon. That'll be the week after that. Let me see what else. If you want to if you want to find Whip on Twitter, you've got to you got to find him again, because Elon didn't want him on the platform. So you're gonna have to find him. What's it? Whipping Spork.
Whipping Spork is the one Whipping Spork. And then in like 6 days, I'll be back on Real Whip Spoon. So
yeah, so just go ahead and nab his back up. That way you don't miss a chance at seeing Ammons.
I am one of the funniest accounts on Twitter that has never made it to 1,000. I am verifiably one of the funniest accounts you've never followed.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. And if you want to follow Jessica, I'm going to give you both of hers as well. If you want to find her regular account, that's at Soup Canarchist.
Yes.
And if she gets kicked off again, which she does occasionally
Which she just did.
More frequently now that Elon has taken over, I've gotten in more trouble apparently.
Yeah, because
dude, we're going to get into that in the Patreon.
She says, yeah, we'll wait for that. And then for me, I have a list of things. If you'd like to continue this conversation, you can join the Patreon at patreon.com/themadOnes. If you want a t-shirt or a mug, you can go to wearethemadOnes.com/store. You can find all of the different iterations of the things that I make there. But if you want something for Christmas, you can go to wearethemadOnes.com/Christmas. If you want to join the Black Tank Club that me and Brad Binkley have started, you can go to blacktankclub.com. And if you want to support our bid for the presidency, you can go to binkleyharless2024.com. That's right. But if you're watching, I'm on Twitter at HamCarlos because Elon still hasn't given me my account back. But Elon. But if you're watching and you'd rather listen so you don't have to see my stupid face, you can go to any podcatcher, your favorite podcatcher, and do it there, or wearethemadOnes.com. If you are listening and you're like, man, I think Whip's probably super handsome and I have no idea what he looks like, you can go to youtube.com/themadOnes, or you can catch it on Rockfin or Rumble. I'm on both of those. But that's all I've got for you till we move over to our after party. So as always, dear friends and compatriots, you have a chance to be a light in the world. So go light it up.